So we want to think about composition all the way through the painting, from the beginning to the end. Think about what we call the figure to ground relationship. So the figure to ground relationship is simply the size and scale of the object within the greater field of the painting. Okay, so how the object sits against the background, for example. So sometimes if you just start painting without thinking about your composition, you'll have objects that are really small in a big canvas. You want to think about it with intention. What do you want your outcome to be? Is it okay?
Yes, you can speak fast.
Okay. Okay. So you want to think about it from the beginning. You're in charge of the painting from step one. Okay. You don't want to get halfway through a painting and realize, man, I should have increased that figure to ground relationship. I should have made the scale a little bit bigger. So we're going to think about that all the way through. That's what the sketches are for. And they'll have you set up where you are set up for the best outcome from the beginning of the painting. That being said, I want my objects to occupy at least a third of the space in this particular painting. And I want to think about where I want them to be in relation to. So do I want them to be centered? Do I want them to be in the upper third of the painting, in the middle third, in the lower third? We'll talk about composition more as we go through. What I want to do with this one is I'm going to put my horizon line at about a third of the way up from the bottom of the canvas. And then I'm going to place the objects there. It's a very traditional way of composing the painting. Okay. So a thought just came in my head that it's gone now. It'll come back. All right, so I'm going to start with either a small round brush or a small filbert. I really like the filbert. It's just a personal choice. The filbert works really well for me. Round brushes sometimes can get splayed out where they don't make a nice clean line. With a filbert, because of the way it's constructed, so it's flat on two sides, but then when you turn it sideways, it's very thin. So if I use that as a line making tool, I can get a really nice clean line with a filbert. Okay, and it's rounded at the top, so you can almost get like a point. With the round, sometimes they get, if you use them, this one I've had for quite a while, so the bristles get a little bit worn down on the tip, and so it doesn't make quite as clean a line. Just sort of. I'm going to lay in, my hand is shaky this morning, just with my Gamsol and thin paint, I'm going to lay in a horizon line there that's about a third of the way up the painting. And then I'm going to come back over here and I want to just block in my shapes. So these are all circles. Anybody get freaked out trying to draw a circle? Okay, don't worry about it. So what I think of when I'm drawing a circle, first off, I'm going to start with that big one. And I'm going to put it a little bit right of center. I'm not going to put it right dead in the middle because that's going to create a bullseye right in the middle of my painting. So I'm going to go a little bit right of center, and I want to look at that horizon line and see how much of that white sphere is above the horizon line and how much is below. So the bottom point of that sphere I'm going to put about here. The top I'm going to put about here. And then I'm going to kind of make a little square to start with. And then I'm going to just fill in those other edges. So like that gestalt I was talking about, the points of a triangle or the points of a square, I just put in the points of a square, and that helps me connect instead of trying to start at one point and make a circle so that it doesn't get wobbly. And it's just sketchy at this point. That's totally cool. I'm not worried about that. So this little white sphere here, there's more of this one below the horizon line than above. I can see that there is a form shadow on this white sphere here. There's a form shadow on the large sphere, and there's a little cast shadow on the back side, on the bottom side of it. And there's a form shadow here on the egg, and a cast shadow on this little egg. So on this white sphere, I've got two values. I've got my light value, and I've got a step lighter than that middle gray. Right? So I'm going to lay those values in there. So I'm going to start with that darker shadow value. And I'm just using the Gamsol right now, not using any medium. So I'm going to step in here and just fill that shape. It's going to be quite generalized at this point. So that's going to be my form shadow. And there's a little bit of cast shadow here. Go right up onto that contour line because I don't want to end up having a bunch of outlines on my painting. So then I'm going to shop towels up here. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to wipe that excess paint off my brush. I'm going to go back with my lighter value, but not white, a step in from white, and I'm going to lightly lay in that lighter value. So I'm working very lean or thin with my paint at this point, and I'm adding no oil to it, so no medium at this point, because I want to make sure that it's not going to interfere with the drying of subsequent layers. Okay. So then the other white sphere, lay in my form shadow. And then I'm going to come back with that lighter value. And they can overlap a little bit. I'm not worried about perfection at this point. I'm just looking for the general composition. So then on my two eggs, which are darker in value than the two spheres, where those form shadows are on the egg, if I squint my eyes, right, the light value on this part of the egg is darker than the form shadow on the sphere. So it's a constant comparison. You can't really think about, is this light or dark? You have to think about it, is it light or dark, and in relation to what, right? In relation to what it's next to. So it's all about the relationships of your values and your forms. Okay, so I'm not doing any blending at this point. It's going to look really sort of schematic. It's a little bit lighter across the top. But it's definitely, in comparison to the form of this egg, is darker in value than the form shadow on the sphere. This is in shadow, this is in light, but this has a darker value, intrinsic value, that is going to separate it from the form behind it. Okay? So then I'm going to go to my other egg, start with my darker values. So then on the background, or the ground plane, is lighter in value than the black of the background, so you've got to consider those values. Now, right here, right there, the cast shadow on this black surface is really dark, right? It's the darkest dark I see. That black surface, even though it's black, it's receiving light here. You've got a cast shadow here. So you can't paint the whole thing black. You want to think about the differences in those values. So where you've got the cast shadow on that black surface, I'm going to go in with my black paint. Now it's going to blend with my egg where the cast shadow on that is, because if you remember, I'm simplifying what I'm painting here down to 4 values. So some of these things, like we were talking about the turn of the head and the lost edge on the shadow side of a round object, that's going to help create that sense of space. So then the background, I'm going to go back to, and I'm going to get a bigger brush because I'm going to be covering more ground here. And I'm going to go back to that medium value, 1 step darker than my middle gray. And I want to think about sort of the direction of my brush strokes too. As I'm working on a flat area, I'm going to use maybe vertical and horizontal brush strokes. Whereas when I'm painting the egg, I'm thinking about how does my brush help describe the round form, and how does my brush help describe a flat surface? So the tools that we use, you have to think about how you use that tool in a way that is best going to simulate and describe the surface of the object, because the magic part of painting is we're taking three-dimensional objects and we're transferring them onto a two-dimensional surface, trying to create the illusion of three dimensions. So there's a little bit of magic trick that happens when you're drawing or you're painting from life and you're trying to describe three-dimensional objects that take up space and have volume, but you're working on a flat surface using paint. That's the challenge and the magic of representational painting, which is what we are working with at the moment, right? We want to create the illusion of these objects on the canvas. My ground plane, again, down here, if I squint my eyes, it's about the same value. This ground plane of the board that my objects are sitting on is about the same value as the shadow, the form shadow, on the objects. So I've got to go back to that lighter value. Oop, that's too light. I didn't have enough paint mixed, so I'm having to kind of mix it as I go. Oh, that's too dark. Like Goldilocks. There we go, just right. So you'll notice also I'm going right up to the edges of the objects that I'm painting. I don't want to leave a halo of unpainted canvas. One of the reasons that we tone the canvas with a different color in these first couple of paintings is so you can see when you've done that. You don't want to paint almost up to the edge of something and almost up to the edge of something and leave unpainted canvas. So again, I want to think about that surface that I am painting. Sorry, my hand gets in the way of the camera. So this is quite thin because I'm going to come back over the top. Yeah, there's a little cast shadow right underneath there. I'm going to let it just run into the egg there. A little bit, just a little sliver of a little bit lighter right there. Okay, so that is my underpainting. So what the underpainting does is it blocks in your major values and your major forms. So at this point I can see what my composition is going to look like. I also can start to read those value patterns, making sure, for example, that my objects aren't levitating and floating and look like they're floating in the air. That there's a shadow underneath that's anchoring this egg to the canvas. Okay, there's a shadow, cast shadow that anchors this sphere to the canvas or to the ground plane. And again, it's quite thin. I'm not worried about detail at this point, not worried about highlights. I'm okay with the fact that this egg here, the back edge of this egg, has disappeared into that shadow because the value of the egg is dark. And those shadow values, if I squint my eyes up here, it's hard to see the difference between the form shadow and the cast shadow if we're only using 4 values.